Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for coming, especially given that the weather outside is quite beautiful, and that make you sit here in a dark room. So I appreciate it very much. Just a short little announcement from my end. What I'm showing is actually built in this product of ours, which is free tier article at Amazon, and it's just basically putting all the various coding environments, Python, R, Octave, and so on, bundles together and puts all the open source quantum computing software on top of it. And in the next release, I was putting these notebooks that I'm using for presentation, I was putting them into the repository so that you can play with those things and look at them afterwards. So everything you see will be eventually in the next Layersforge image. And as I said, it's at this point completely free to use as long as you stay within the Amazon limits of the free tier offer that they have, which fair enough, you can only use for 1 year, but they only go by email. So actually, if you have another email you can use, you can just go into Amazon and they give you yet another year. They could check it on the credit card as well, but apparently they don't. With that out of the way, what are we talking about today, or what I want to talk about is obviously the blockchain and quantum computing and how it interrelates. And before I start and take this away, this is not a corporate presentation, it's not a lecture, so feel free to interrupt me anytime you have something that you want to ask or say or comment. I really want to have this be a discussion driven. There's not any set necessary stream that I have to follow through here. I mean, obviously I will start this off as a presentation, but by all means I encourage everybody to just step in and say something, especially when there's no signal. What's going on? Is that normal?
No, it's not normal.
I wouldn't think so, right? Why do I actually want to talk about blockchain in the context of quantum computing? And I would like to do like a little quick check here. Within this room, who has worked in any capacity with any blockchain technology before, like mining something, Bitcoin mining, or any sorry. Since you're walking through it, so okay. I have technical troubles right now anyhow, so it's not like interrupting anything important at this point. The machine just crashed on me. So anyhow, yeah, quick check. Who did anything here with Bitcoin, like mining or transacting anything, like paying something? Okay, so I've got a couple of hands here. Okay, so let's take it one step further. Who has done anything with blockchain that is not Bitcoin? Okay, so I've got one, two. Okay, all right. All right, because the big one, obviously in Toronto, is the Ethereum one, which kind of was a brainchild of Vitalik Buterin, who started here in Toronto and is Toronto-based, but then they moved over to Switzerland. The interesting thing, yeah, and probably just for, yeah, to drive the point home. I think I probably can assume that nobody in this room has yet worked on anything with a quantum computer. If so, please raise your arm. Did anybody here work on anything like do quantum computing coding, anything of that sort? No. Okay. Okay, good. So because that's basically what attracted me to the blockchain community, to the people who know Bitcoin and know Ethereum, because those people, they have at least some cursory understanding about quantum computing, and if only because there's a threat they identified, because it is potentially something that could undermine the crypto system that powers the blockchain. So to me, it's always very nice to actually go to people who I don't have to always explain quantum computing over again. And it has actually gotten better. I don't know, did you at all see Trudeau's little explanation of quantum computing that he did at the beginning when he visited the IQC in Waterloo? Because that helped me a lot too. After Trudeau actually explained what a qubit was, next time I went to my dentist and said I was doing quantum computing, she actually knew. It's like, oh, that's what Trudeau mentioned the other day. That was actually quite helpful. So I wanted to get to talk more about it, but unfortunately he hasn't since then. So, of course, journalists have to ask him the question, I guess, in order to get there. So yeah, that is why it's really always nice to run into blockchain people. They have an idea. Everything that the blockchain does is powered because they can use strong cryptography for it. And what really powers quantum computing as an academic research area, because then all of a sudden the money started flowing in, was this realization that we can actually do something with a quantum computer that no classical machine can do, which will eventually break our encryption schemes. And that, of course, got the attention of people in the government and military with very deep pockets. And so a lot of money was flowing into this area after that. And the publications in that area just exploded afterwards. So what I want to get to eventually when this computer is actually up again is show you the dramatic difference that this actually makes if you look at the scaling behavior between a classical machine and what the quantum computer can do. So hopefully Windows will get there, and I will get there. And I don't know if you can also connect an external machine,
yeah,
right?
Try.
So if anything else fails, then there's probably our fallback option here. So I might as well set that up. I always thought that I'm safe now from these kind of technical glitches because I have everything on the Amazon cloud, so I can just use whatever computer is available. But
what we've learned is unless you spotted the right number of chickens, you cannot appease the demo gods.
Yes. No, I certainly can see that now.
The screen's up.
Oh, screen's up, awesome. So let's try this again. Still very much in I'm doing something mode. Chrome. Oh yeah, while Chrome is starting up, I'm just going to also see what kind of connection I have here. Oh, that looks good. Looks promising. Chrome's coming up. Alright, let's try this again.
Maybe you trigger a restore. Might bring it back to the number.
Oh yeah, good point. Good thinking. Thank you. Alright, so alright, so another thing that I find very attractive about the blockchain community and the technology is that it's open source. That's also something that we very strongly believe in because it allows you actually to go up against the really big corporations with very deep pockets if you can build a community around something. And that really, I think, is Bitcoin probably is a perfect example for that, probably the most prominent example after Linux now. Then, of course, there's a rather fascinating history attached to it. To this day, we have no idea who actually started Bitcoin, who authored the paper that started it all. It was authored under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, and nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. There have been lots of speculations, people trying to chase him down, and so far I think it's pretty much unresolved. The other thing, of course, is if it's open source, it's not really controlled by one company, so it's much more open, competitive landscape. And what I found after I went to some of these meetups of the blockchain community here, especially the one in Ethereum, is that it really is truly a remarkable community. I mean, there's really a sense of people trying to change the world to some extent, which the term disruptive has been thrown around a lot. But if you actually build a currency that can work without a central bank, that is pretty damn disruptive. I mean, there's a reason why people always, governments always want to have that control of the purse, and that is essentially taking it back. So in a sense, I always thought you're pretty much living in the age of the after the death of ideologies. I mean, you still have kind of a couple of hang-ons around the world, but all the bigger ideologies essentially are dead. And on the other hand, there's also no real positive utopia anymore. I mean, all the science fiction movies nowadays is always dystopians, nothing really positive. But the people who are building this kind of technology, they actually believe in positive change can be affected by this kind of technology. And it cuts across the political spectrum. It's, libertarians are as attracted to it as people who are liberal-minded, who are basically saying, well, if you can give a cryptocurrency to people in the developed world, they have actually the chance to build savings and to have that kind of capital requirement that you need in order to be able to have to build more of an economy. You need the ability to save. You need capital. So it's very interesting just from that point of view as well. So having said that, what of course attracts most people nowadays is a very simple fact, and that is that this thing is going through the roof. So that is almost like a chart probably you would have seen if anybody could have charted back then the price of tulips in the famous tulip market. So, very, very crazy market, and seeing almost an exponential growth, and now obviously broke down a little bit again, but still the volatility and the movement is obviously getting a lot of attention. So obviously with so much riding on it, any threat to that crypto system is something to be taken very serious. And that's why obviously you want to understand, well, how are quantum computers going to impact this? And how close are we to actually having that kind of impact? So that's what I'm going to try to answer here. And first of all, as I mentioned before, the scaling behavior. And let's see if I can make this full screen. It was F11. So the formula obviously doesn't really tell you that much, which is why I plotted these things religiously. And if you just start with completely trivial numbers that any child can factorize, you see obviously the classical one starts out perfectly fine, but obviously there's nothing to do really here, so it's kind of pointless. But very quickly, Shor's algorithm looks like it's just flat lining, but they'll see the classical one, even if you just go up to 20, is already taking off in terms of processing steps that have to be taken. And you basically have to, if you go to numbers that actually matter, that not trivial, at least for a human to factorize, you have to do a log scale already to have a meaningful comparison and to get those things on the same chart anymore.
Sorry, could you explain what's the GNFS?
Yeah, that's the best classical algorithm at this point for factorization that is known, that you can basically run on your desktop or any classical cluster for that matter. And the S, I think, stands for SIF, there's some filtering involved. I could not tell you the exact implementation of the algorithm. I basically just looked up at Wikipedia, okay, what's the best algorithm we have right now? And that one popped up, and then I looked at the scaling. And so the amount of steps that it has to do.
Sneak across, you'll be okay.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. So yeah, this thing is just scaling extremely, extremely steep. And if you compare for one of these numbers here, by just looking at the processing steps, this thing here, if you just go out 2 more, right? This is just 1,112 and 1,110, and this is an axis basically where you have 153 zeros at the end there in terms of increase of steps that have to be taken. So it's completely astronomical. It just grows extremely fast. Shor's algorithm, on the other hand, and I made a little bit of a mistake here by already showing that. We should not panic about it. Here we go. So now it's hitting again. If you look at the same difference here, just 2 more. Shor's algorithm here is in the billions, but if you actually count, we are down on the last digit here on that axis, which if I count it correctly should actually just be millions. So you can actually count that each step here is just 1 million more in terms of required processing steps. And of course, if you compare that, we are moving here in the millions versus an astronomical number with 153 zeros on each step. It's an extreme difference. So basically what that means is that with Shor's algorithm, we have always the chance to catch up to an increase in key length by just building a bigger machine. We can actually build this machine, but we have super exponential growth with the best classical algorithm that essentially gets to the point when we double the key length, there's no way you can't muster the resources to build a classical machine that could actually ever solve this problem within the age of the universe, essentially. And with quantum algorithm, like Shor's algorithm, you can catch up. You can do it. It's doable. But again, I already had that shown here. We don't have to panic because it still requires an awful lot of steps and an awful lot of qubits. And in fact, if you look at what they be able to factorize with Shor's algorithm so far, it's really not very impressive. The largest one with Shor's algorithm is 21. That's what actually has been done. And the ion trap architecture is trying to catch up to what they did there with the photons. And they got only to 15 so far. And then on top of that, there are even some researchers argue that it's really not proving or implementing Shor's algorithm properly. They're basically taking shortcuts. So it's really very early stage when it comes to Shor's algorithm. On the other hand, there's this intrepid little quantum computing startup out of Vancouver who paved their own path in terms of how they approach quantum computing, and they did it in a manner that really did not sit well with many academics who preferred what they call the gate-based model, where you essentially use the same model that you use for classical computing and just look at how do these operations translate if you work with qubits rather than bits. And what D-Wave basically did was going for an approach that is special purpose but is easier to actually implement with qubits, because the qubits are so difficult to control, which is why it's so hard to scale up a universal quantum computer. And they basically picked a problem class where you can couple qubits in a manner that is less structured, and they don't even implement any error correction on it, and they still manage to do something useful with it. The process that they are implementing is called quantum annealing, and I can talk about this a little bit more in detail later. But anyhow, they also can implement an algorithm where they basically have an optimization problem, or formulate the factorization as an optimization problem, which is the kind of class that this machine can solve. And they actually got up to over 200,000 at this point, which is certainly much more impressive and something that actually demonstrates that this is a real calculation happening. And you can't just guess the result. Interesting difference between what they do and what Shor's algorithm, or how Shor's algorithm is implemented. For Shor's algorithm, it's really just the bit length of your key that determines how many qubits you need. There's pretty much a linear relationship between the bit length of that key and how many qubits. And it's more complicated with the D-wave. And I'm going to try this, hoping that it's actually not working. So with the D-wave, we actually have this relationship here. Does it work? No. Anyhow, that was supposed to be highlighting. And this guy is the guy who actually invented this architecture. So they have an architecture that is scaling differently, but it's still scaling in a fairly benign way. So it's only the square of the bit width that goes into it. And this is one of those slides that was driving the theoretical computer scientist batty. And to Geordie Rowe's credit, I have to say, he didn't name it Rowe's law. It was one of the investors into D-Wave that created that chart, or that created that term. And it was Steve Jurvetson. And they pretty much managed to double their capacity. But that chart is a little bit older, so obviously we are in 2017, and they're not faster than the universe at this point, and they're probably not ever going to be faster than the universe. And so that claim that D-Wave and that there's this problem that they can tackle the same kind of complexity that a universal quantum computer can tackle, and the kind of overselling that is typical for venture capital culture, that did not sit well with many computer scientists, like, for instance, MIT Scott Arison. Actually, he is at the University of Boston now. And it's set up a very contentious back and forth between this guy again, Geordie Rowe, who also is a physicist, and some people in the quantum computing community who basically said that this machine is not a real quantum computer. It's never going to scale properly, and D-Wave really had to fight tooth and nail to establish credibility after they've been lambasted like that. And it started with them basically proving that on the chip they actually have a qubit. Then they showed that there's actual entanglement on the chip. And then Matthias Troyer et al., they did a very extensive classification of the device, and they basically concluded, well, it looks like they built what they set out to build, which was quantum annealing. And at this point, they have a chip that has 2,000 of these qubits in the mile. So they're much further ahead in the raw qubit count, but not all qubits are created equal. Of course, since we have a lot of people here who are new to this whole subject area, let's first recuperate a little bit and step back and actually look at what a qubit is supposed to be. So I'm actually going to clear this for a moment here. Because what most people know about qubits is essentially you have something that is in the same or in opposite states. Like for instance, what is used mostly for the implementation of these chips nowadays is magnetic momentum. And so basically it's like you have magnetic momentum going up and going down at the same time. And obviously that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The fact of the matter is there's more going on than meets the eye, which obviously you already saw at this point, which is that there's an actual Bloch sphere here. The Bloch sphere is an expression of the kind of physics that's allowed with a qubit and how these states mix. So in fact, you don't ever have this situation where things are mixing in a way that they basically polar opposite. The mixing angles are more complicated than that. It's essentially a system that is much richer than just this idea that you have two states that are opposite coexisting at the same time. The kind of mixing that these states allow are actually dominated or can be expressed geometrically as a sphere. So you have a multidimensional system. A qubit is actually much richer than just a bit because it's an analog system where you can actually have a whole two-dimensional spherical volume to explore. And the way that the mixing happens is that if you're sitting on this equator, that is essentially when you have this what's called a superposition state. And if you were to measure any state that is sitting on the equator along that z-axis, what you basically get is with 50% probability you get the thing going up, or you get it with a 50% probability going down. These probabilities as quantum potential, they are physically realized. These probabilities have actual physical meaning. You can calculate with them, and that's what all quantum mechanics is all about, is that we do calculations with these state vectors. And what's nice about the math behind it is actually it's quite simple in comparison to many other things in physics because it's perfectly linear. The only thing that's a little bit odd about it is that the numbers that we put in there as factors, the linear factors, are complex numbers. So that's the only thing out of the ordinary, really. If you do the math and the trigonometric relations that feed this whole thing, basically you get to this rather long, unwieldy formula, how these mixing angles on the Bloch sphere are related to those factors that go into it. And the reason that they look that way is simply because for these quantum probabilities, you have to square them for them to have the probabilities of, or the properties of a normal probability. So that's where the normalization comes in. So that is kind of the stuff that Trudeau left out of his explanation.
Conveniently.
But anyhow, so that's why I filled it in here. And then the reason that really, I mean, why do we need complex numbers and what is this about? And that was actually a question that came up. A data scientist posed that to me in one of these meetups. Why complex numbers? Can't we not do it without complex numbers? And the reason why we usually don't, and why it's difficult to do, is because complex numbers are so handy to deal with rotations. And if you have something like a sphere, being able to deal with rotations is extremely useful. And so that's really what is driving this. I always like to ask who here has actually work to do with complex numbers? Like everyday work. Okay, very good. We got one person, two people, three. Okay, four. Excellent. So may I ask you what you do with complex numbers?
Weather forecast model.
Weather one. Oh, very good. Excellent.
Lots of complex numbers.
Yes.
Spherical harmonic expansions.
Yeah.
Fourier transforms.
Right.
Lots of data stuff.
Yeah. Excellent. What is it? Okay. Interesting. There was one over here.
Yeah, it's waiters. Waiter technology.
Okay, radar technology, excellent. Yeah, so again, it is when you're dealing with wave phenomena, obviously the expansion into complex numbers becomes very natural, and actually may just jump ahead here a little bit to make that kind of visually obvious. If you just project the rotation onto one dimension, you end up with a perfect sine wave, and that basically is what you have here is an oscillator in one dimension. What you have here, what rotation is nothing but an oscillator in two dimension. So if you can do rotation, you can also do waves quite nicely. And the nice thing about a complex number is that they are operators as well. So if you have any of these complex numbers, and of course in Python the nice thing is they are built in. So if you just multiply a unit complex number with the other unit complex number, it just rotates you around the unit circle. So a complex number has a built-in property to be an operator to just rotate you around. And that works nicely with a 90-degree angle, and if you go and do it with an angle that is 45 degrees, you just have to use the sine and cosine values here for it, and off you go, and you can just multiply your unit complex number again, like you did with the 90 degrees, and you just move from one of these spots to the next. Very, very handy to deal with rotations. And now, if you realize that we are dealing with one of those things on a sphere, obviously it would be nice to have something that maps directly onto a sphere, like an operator, like the complex numbers do in the plane. But the way that mathematical tools have been developed and convention has been developed, essentially what happens is we use the complex numbers for the plane and then augment it with matrix algebra to deal with the rotations on the sphere. But there's one little fun fact maybe that I always like to throw in here. Called it imaginary number, and that's why I always have this slide here. It's like is one of those axes more imaginary than the other one? I really don't think so, right? It's like it's really just defamatory to call it that. And actually, if you look back at the history, that's exactly what happened. I mean, everybody here knows a Cartesian coordinate system, right? That's a normal coordinate system that we're always working with. And Dekant was obviously very proud of the way that he developed that. And with imaginary numbers, you have a different metric. So you basically have a different way of dealing with numbers in the number plane. And he hated that. And he didn't like the idea of imaginary numbers whatsoever. And he coined the term imaginary specifically to be directory. So nowadays, maybe we'd call them fake numbers or alternative fact number or something like that. And the annoying thing is that the guys who developed the mathematics and Gauss and Euler, they just stuck with the name. And then they called it also complex numbers, which really doesn't help either. Because if you tell a student, guess what, you're going to learn something that is really complex, it's not very motivational. So I really think the complex numbers get very much bad marketing rap because of it. And then there's another interesting fun fact that I always like to throw in here. You can also extend complex numbers, make it more general. You can't do it in 3 dimensions, strangely enough, but you can do it in 4 dimensions. And Hilbert did that. And he, of course, was a giant in terms of mathematics. and he scratched that relationship actually into a bridge when he had this epiphany, and so they have this plaque now in Dublin on this bridge where he wrote down this relationship. And the reason why I like to bring that up is because I find you can almost visualize something in 4 dimensions if you think about a 4-dimensional coordinate system and think about quaternions doing the same kind of 90 degrees rotation that complex numbers can do in the complex number plane. These quaternions, the algebra that they implement is actually precisely the algebra that we use for quantum mechanics now. And because, as I mentioned, the conventions are so that we rather work with complex numbers now than with quaternions. But the Pauli matrices, which are the underpinning also of the most basic quantum computing algorithms, they essentially are just that. They have the same algebra as quaternions. And again, driving home the fact that if you deal with more than one qubit, what you basically deal with is simply a hypersphere. So instead of having it in 3 dimensions, which you can still nicely visualize, once you entangle 2 qubits, we are sitting on a hypersphere, and then as you add qubits, you're just getting more and more, and always starting basically with 2 qubits, we have a 4-dimensional sphere, and then just as we bring in more parameters, the dimensions of the sphere explodes. And then really all you do with a quantum computing algorithm is you're moving this high-dimensional state vector around on this hypersphere, and you're projecting down into more restricted spaces. So just to get you an idea of that things can get pretty complex pretty fast once you deal with higher dimensions, I always like to show that little tesseract, which is nothing but a 4-dimensional cube projected down, and it's rotating, and it's projected down into 3, and then obviously for the screen 2 dimensions. And so by having the thing rotate, it does pretty crazy things in that lower dimensionality. And now mention you had an n-dimensional Rubik's Cube, and you basically have a prescription to how to rotate these slices of these cubes in very many high dimensions. And kind of the way you can think about the quantum algorithm is that you can actually encode a problem by setting up the cube in a certain way, and then you have prescription of how to actually rotate this thing. But then in the end, when you measure, you can only look at one of the faces of the cube. That's the only thing you're allowed to look at. And that is kind of the way that a quantum algorithm works. And it's a very convoluted way to actually think up the process of steps you have to go through. And I honestly don't know how Shor did it originally, or David Deutsch for that matter, who came up with the first quantum algorithm that was better than classical. Because you can't do it in a linear fashion. You know, if you code anything in a classical language, I mean, it's always step by step. It's pretty clear going from A to B. And with a quantum algorithm, you really have to kind of think around the corner to find a way to mold the problem in a way that is amendable to be solved by a quantum machine. And another thing, of course, to also remember is because we're dealing with quantum states, what you get out of a quantum computer is not deterministic. It is a probability. Basically, an answer from a quantum computer is a repeated measurement that gives you a very clear signal, but it's still going to be a probability distribution that you're getting. So you have to repeatedly measure, and the more you measure, the more precise you can get an answer. And that is true for any architecture, be it the classical design that the academics want and that IBM and Microsoft is trying to build, or what you get with a debate machine. So I've talked a lot now about D-Wave, and I try to give you a little bit of an idea of what the universal QC is doing in terms of gate rotations. But the D-Wave machine, in a sense, is much simpler to understand. And I just put the link in here to the tutorial because that really is the best way to, if you want to see the details, the best way to actually go to their site and look at it. And their problem that they're setting up is in the literature, it's called an Ising model that came from modeling magnets, where you have certain orientations of the spin of a magnet. If you think about orientations of magnetic momentum, you typically have in material, you don't have an overall orientation. These magnetic momentums just sit all over the place. If you put an external field on it, sometimes these things spontaneously reorder themselves, and you can actually magnetize something. You probably all had issues with like magnets magnetizing a screwdriver or something like that. So these elemental magnets can be reoriented. And if you model that, you basically look at the cost function and energy function for this orientation of the spin. And that's a mathematical model really that's underlying the D-Wave machine. And the way that they illustrate on their site is by basically just looking at light switches, and essentially they tell you to play this game visually, where you have the ability to switch it either to 1 or to 0, either 1 or off, and there's going to be a penalty for each switch that is toggled. And in a classical world, obviously everything is either on or off. Then things get a little bit more mathematically. That's how they express it, and things get a little bit more complicated when you then introduce also relationships between those light switches. So basically, when one is on and the other one is off, you get a certain weight attributed and a certain contribution sent to one switch to another switch, and based on if the switch is on or off, it's either a signal that is that's amplified, or a signal that is essentially muted. If you come from an AI background, artificial neural networks or something like that, this already may look somewhat familiar because you have this network structure and you have weights associated with nodes, and that's essentially is what D-Wave is very much aiming at. Basically have an architecture that you can map onto artificial neural networks. Now that's one thing in the classical world, and then of course the interesting bit is, well, if we don't have a classical switch but we have actually a qubit there, we can explore this space or an error function that we're constructing essentially across the entire space. And the notion of the fact that you have the superposition and a switch being on and off, that is what very often motivated an explanation that is very popular, and I'm glad Trudeau did not go there. But the very popular notion of explaining the power of quantum computers is to basically say, well, we have all these possibilities that can be realized simultaneously in a quantum computer. Of course, my switch here can be 0 and 1 at the same time, and so it's like I'm doing parallel every possible combination. And that quantum parallelism is very easy to motivate by looking at a problem like that. But if you go back and look at the block sphere and actually analyze a qubit, you realize that, well, there's more to the story. It's not just a simple I'm in two spaces at the same time. I'm actually exploring a higher dimensional space So things are not quite like that I'm just going every possible combination. A quantum computer can explore the parameter space much richer that way, but it still does not actually physically realize every possible combination at the same time. So what the architecture implements in the end is that you have to configure, essentially almost like in this light switch game, you have to configure the chip with weights, and the switches become actually qubits, and the connections become actual physical couplings. So you have the ability to basically tell a qubit, okay, this is how much you're actually going to notice of the field strength of your neighbor. And that coupling can be basically dynamically set from the outside. And so you basically have to set up the system initially with these weights, and then your system is at the beginning is frozen basically with these weights at a fairly high energy level. Imagine you have a grid of little compasses. Each compass has this little magnetic momentum, and they notice and feel the magnetic field of their neighbor. And you bring in some disturbances, and those things are going to go pretty well and going to rotate around a lot until they try to find the most energy efficient state. And this energy efficient state that they eventually get to may not be the overall best state. And in a classical system, it typically isn't. So what you have if you set a problem like this is you have essentially some sort of energy landscape, and it's really quite the same situation as with artificial intelligence. If you are familiar with training and backpropagation algorithms in AI, essentially you have a cost function that you want to try to minimize for your artificial neural network, and you want to obviously find the overall solution of your landscape. Yes, please.
What about including notion of time? Because what we have here, for example, like it can be just like one specific time. But when we move in time, things will change. So do we have this in consideration?
Well, the time component in the quantum engineering specifically is that you start out in a fairly high energy state, so in a less than optimal state, and you're basically trying to move the system to this lower state here. What you do if you do the steps in a back process, you basically look at the gradient and you're trying to find a gradient descent algorithm that gets you to the correct value that you want to move into. And if you're unlucky and you start out like this, it's going to get you nowhere because it actually leads you to the wrong minimum. So what the system does physically, it basically it's like a particle with a fairly high Brownian motion, and that's where the temperature actually really physically comes in. So it has this potential to basically randomly move the state of your chip around towards, well, hopefully a situation where it is more optimal than before. And if you do classical annealing, that's really all it does. You have this Brownian motion that can get you randomly over these humps. The wonderful thing about quantum mechanics and quantum annealing is that a quantum system, unlike a classical particle, lives in a probability distribution. That means they are not fully localized in one spot. There's always the probability to find your particle outside its current position. So, for instance, let's say we have a particle here that doesn't really have energy high enough to actually jump to the next valley. If you look at the probability distribution for this location, a quantum system only has the highest likelihood of being in this place, and it's still going to have a tail of probability to be found outside of that valley. And if that falls into a location that is energetically actually better for it, that kind of quantum transition can actually happen. It would be an allowed transition at this point. So that is an additional quantum effect that the D-Wave chip can leverage over what classical annealing would allow. And one of the complaints from the academic side with regards to D-Wave was that they basically argued, yeah, well, they probably built an annealer, but they probably just built a classical annealer, and these quantum effects here don't actually exist. And that is basically what D-Wave has put a lot of energy in trying to convince them that actually these kind of effects happen on their chip. So it's a combination of having this Brownian motion that can do these random fluctuations, but then also of the quantum probabilities that have this ability to basically see further than just this localized particle could if it was a classical system. The annealing process is, coming back to the time question, just a matter of lowering the temperature of the system to basically freeze it out in this minimum state if the algorithm actually works. You can get situations where basically you set something up in your D-Wave chip and the problem is intractable and it still gets caught somewhere outside of the global minimum. But if the problem is amenable to the D-Wave chip approach, basically what you get after a time which is also problem dependent is obviously the idea that you get a signal out of your quantum chip that basically indicates, okay, this is where we are, and you measure it over and over again, and you get a more and more pronounced signal of this is actually the location that we found for our energy system, and then obviously for all the benchmarking that goes on right now, we typically put in this problem that we already know the solution for, and then we try to figure out well, how long do we actually have to anneal this thing to get the kind of fidelity that we want. And that's the kind of benchmarking that has been done on the D-Wave quite a bit. For instance, for the factorization of that number, the 200,000 or so, that was done, I believe, on a 500 or was it 1,000 qubit? I think it was a 1,000 qubit chip. So half of what they currently have now. That took 3.5 seconds. And interestingly, that was not dependent on what kind of integer they put in there for factorization. It was always 3.5 seconds was the annealing time that they found worked to get like with 99.9 or whatever fidelity, the correct answer. And again, the longer you do it, and the more you measure, the more precise you can get. And the annealing time basically would go out and become longer and longer, the more complicated the problem is. And essentially, if you have an intractable problem, you can try to wait and get the system into the state, and it just will never happen. And if you look at the energy landscape, that where that kind of annealing time would happen is you have like awful lot of minimums, and they're positioned in a way that they can't really jump very easily from one to the other. And then you have an energy landscape like that, and typically NP complete problems are suspected to have that kind of energy landscape. Then you get infinite annealing times. It essentially never really finds the correct minimum. So that certainly can happen. And the thing with the quantum annealing design is, which is why theorists don't like it, we don't have a whole lot of theory around it. We can't model it very well because the quantum algorithms in the universal model map on directly onto rotations in higher dimensions. You can use all the matrix algebra methods that have been developed to basically prove theorems around it, and you can prove that Shor's algorithm is doing what it's supposed to do. In a model like that, you're essentially just throwing in an energy function, and then you basically let the system do its thing, hands off, and it either finds the solution or it doesn't. But you don't know exactly how it's getting there, and you can't really model it very well. The only thing basically in terms of theoretical understanding, at least to my knowledge, is that you can map quantum algorithms to an Hamiltonian that you can put into a general adiabatic quantum computer. So the general form of what DVAG is doing is basically just taking any energy function, not only the one that is mapping onto this particular class of problems. So if you can do any energy function, any Hamiltonian in the quantum mechanical language, and you can have an annealing process unconstrained on what kind of class of energy function you put in, then you can show that is also universally quantum Turing complete, as I call it. So anything that a universal quantum computer gate-based can do, an general adiabatic machine should be able to do as well. But the theorists, again, don't have a handle on the problem of annealing time. So theoretically, it should do everything that a universal quantum computer can do in a gate model. But how long actually the annealing times are going to be for these problems is unclear. And with a universal quantum computer, a gate model, the time that it takes to solve the problem is simply something of how long it takes to apply each rotation to your quantum qubit system. And if you have error control solid enough that after you apply one of these transformations, you get a good signal for your qubit, and your qubit state is not decaying, then essentially it's just a matter of how quickly in succession can you apply these rotations. Think about, again, Rubik's Cube, right? I mean, you've got people who are breaking records all the time. So if you can build a system that can apply these rotations very quickly, then that is basically the speed that you get in terms of execution time for your algorithm. So you have much more technical control over that. And here you really don't. You basically set it up and then you let the machine just do its thing, which is why that is often compared to an analog computer. If you think back about the olden times in computing, before we had digital devices, people used analog devices for solving differential equations, for instance. And they were very error prone because, again, analog, so you don't have a number that you actually work with. You have an analog signal, then you have to mold and try to find the correct answer. And they were actually quite prevalent. All the military systems that used for the ballistics calculation way back before you had digital computers, it was all done with analog computers. And so it's quite doable, but they became basically extinct like the dinosaurs as soon as digital machines came around.
Is there a theory for error correction in either of these two methods of doing calculation?
Yes, and the error correction essentially works on the qubit level. So if you go back to what actually an error means in the qubit, basically you want your qubit state to be fixed to that spot on the sphere. And so any wandering off of that position, that is introducing an error for you. because any wandering off, you want to do control. You want to always have controlled rotations. So the error correction on both sides, for the adiabatic as well as for the universal, is essentially the same. You want to fix that qubit in its position. And the problem with error correction on a qubit is the fact that quantum mechanical systems, they collapse into the classical state once you measure them. So if you have actually a qubit state like that one and you measure it, you either end up with 0 or 1. So how do we correct something that we actually can't measure? So that is the fundamental problem of quantum error correction, and there has been a huge amount of literature developed and devoted to it. And there's a concept called weak measurement, where you can probe a quantum system without actually destroying the qubit of the quantum system completely. And so weak measurements is really what has to happen for getting this kind of information out of there. And so what you do essentially, what you have now is codes, error correction codes, that kind of nudge the qubit back into the position where it is started without destroying the qubit itself. And the error correction, the progress of the error correction is determining how fast and how much you can actually progress on the universal quantum computing front. And IBM has 2 protocols implemented, error correction protocols implemented on their chip right now. And they basically say, well, we are working on the 3rd one, and if we have a 3rd protocol, the 3rd error correction code on it, they think they have good enough control over the state of the qubit that they can scale it up first to 50 and then beyond. So an enormous amount of work has been done in that area. It has been really almost like a focus for most of the academic work in quantum computing has been focused on how to get error correction codes that work. And again, that is why D-Wave is such an outlier when you compare it to what the academics have been working on. Because they basically just said, well, we're just going to put our qubit out there, couple them, and you know, we're not going to worry about error correction at all, because we figure if we set up the problem quickly enough, and because we are in an annealing process, if we have any additional noise from decoherence, it's just an additional perturbation of our qubit, and we want noise at the beginning anyhow, so we're not even going to worry about it for our quantum annealing process, which is interesting approach to say the least. And the funny thing is, it kind of works because they essentially exploit just spontaneous entanglements between the qubits to some extent to get this quorum sensing in a sense to find the other minimum, which is another quantum mechanical effect that they have on their beyond quantum tunneling. And so the entanglement states on their chip are very, very short-lived and not controlled like on a universal quantum computer. But because they basically just put their wild qubits out there in the chip, you can implement software error correction codes on top of that, and that's what some researchers have been doing. So you can couple 4 qubits together to make a logical qubit which has higher quality than these qubits in the wild that the D-Wave chip implements. And there have been some experiments done that indicate they seem to actually benefit from that kind of error correction. So interestingly, Google, which was one of the first customers of D-Wave, they decided they want their own chip, and they are perfectly happy with that model of adiabatic computing, because what they want to use it for is artificial intelligence and deep learning, which really that particular quantum annealing model is very useful for. And so they basically set out, well, you know what? We believe in that research that indicates error correction actually is going to help us with our quantum annealing as well. And so they are implementing now or building a chip that does quantum annealing but with error correction. So it's going to be interesting to compare and also to see how D-Wave is basically reacting to the customer turning around and becoming a competitor in a sense. And if they also going to implement error correction on their future designs.
I'm going to sort of flip the question because the topic is really quantum computing and blockchain.
Right. So let's get back to the blockchain, right?
So the idea is that, you know, if you've got a blockchain key, then quantum computing is going to be able to crack it. And what are the implications of that?
Yeah.
But could you not flip this and say, look, use quantum computing to come up with an alternative encryption method, and don't even use it as encryption, some other method, and say, once we've set that, then we've solved the problem, as opposed to trying to apply, you know, quantum computing to a traditional computing problem, say, like, make it a quantum encryption method, and in which case you've solved the problem.
And quantum encryption is actually quite big as its own research field. And China, for instance, just set a record in terms of being able to have a satellite used for actually having a tangled photon pair that is the ingredient, the key ingredient for having the quantum key exchange protocol implemented. So absolutely no doubt, if you have quantum encryption, you have quantum encryption resources, you can build something that is much more solid than what we're currently building on our digital machines. And I'm actually jumping ahead here a little bit. There is such a thing as quantum money even. So it's a guy even back in '83, he came up with that idea that, you know what, I mean, since a quantum state can't actually be cloned, we could use it to use quantum information resources to have an absolutely unique identifier for such a thing as money. It's pretty funny because back then everybody thought it was crazy and never got this idea published. and now it's actually a research field, right? So people are thinking about that, absolutely. And it's probably going to go that way at one point. It has its own problems because of the non-cloning theory. You can't have backup of your money, so you can actually burn your quantum money quite reliably, right? If it's gone, it's gone. So that's another problem. But yeah, that is a research area that's actually quite rich and taking off to some extent now. But fortunately for Bitcoin, really, if you look at the protocol, there are ways to make it quantum safe. And I put the question, for instance, to Vitalik Buterin here when he gave a lecture just a month ago or so. And he basically says, yeah, well, we are well positioned for post-quantum encryption methods because we just use an API that allows us to just switch it out when needed. So his point basically is, since this is a distributed lecture system, and if we have a higher or a longer key length, the size of blockchain just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we want to use the optimal key length at each time, and always also use the best solution. But if it becomes necessary, basically his point is he can switch it out against something that at this point is thought to be quantum safe. And of course that's the other point. At all times we just have a certain understanding of what's quantum safe and what's not quantum safe. Because when in 2008 the protocol was suggested, it was known that elliptic curve cryptography can be broken by Shor's algorithm, but it was probably not known very widely at that point, because even the National Institute for Standards was still kind of pushing elliptical curve cryptography as a new standard. So it's kind of like an unfortunate accident that you just picked something that turned out to be quite amenable to an extended Shor's algorithm. And it actually turns out it's actually easier to break for something like Shor's algorithm. Not that much easier, but it's certainly not immune to it. So I don't know how well people are familiar with the crypto system that underlies the Bitcoin. So I'm just going to go through here a little bit to indicate where actually the breakdown occurs if you have a successful quantum attack. So the ingredients for Bitcoin is really just 5 things in a sense. You need a digital signature, and basically the message, the transaction that, for instance, I give 5 Bitcoins here to Steve. It is that record of the transaction is essentially the coin. The message is the money, so to speak. Obviously, in order to not be able to turn around and say, well, I never gave the money to Steve. If I digitally sign it, and I'm the only one who has a private key, then there's really no way for me to actually get out of that commitment. And then obviously, to track the ownership of a coin or a transaction, you need a unique serial number for it. And then the other fantastic idea is that we don't want this unique serial number to be from a central bank. We don't want a central trust instance. We just basically delegate that to a network and ask the network to validate a transaction for us and to give us a unique serial number. So the idea is to make basically everyone collectively the central bank. And then there's another thing that's a little bit subtle, might be needed in order to make it workable to prevent exploits. You need something like a proof of work, kind of a method to ensure that the people who are validating this transaction stay honest about it and don't provide invalid validations that would allow us to double spend something. And then, of course, we also need a transaction order enforced, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to track these transactions from wallet to wallet. But the cryptographic underpinning that at the beginning, and which is the one that quantum computers could break, is really the digital signature. And that one is probably for everybody familiar to some extent. If you use any private public key infrastructure, SSH for instance, instead of a password, you want to use like a key, or you use RSA or any of those things. So it's always the same steps. You generate your keys. You have one that's going to be public, and you have one that's going to be your secret, and you want to keep that one in a safe place and basically make unreadable to anybody but yourself. You use the private key is what you use to sign your message. And you give the public key out to everybody, and you can send your message that is signed with your private key, and then on the receiving end, you know the public key, you have a verification algorithm, and through the public key, only if you actually have it encrypted with your private key, is there going to be a message that actually makes sense. Otherwise, you can't decrypt it. There's not going to be a message. It has to be the fitting public key for your private key. So as soon as Shor's algorithm on a quantum computer that's powerful enough to break this, as soon as that becomes available, essentially, once your public key is out there, you can reverse engineer your private key. So somebody could, with a powerful enough quantum computer, immediately, as soon as they get your public key, they could impersonate you. And they could send transaction, and they would look like it comes from you, because you stole that private key by being able to reverse engineer this elliptical curve encryption process. So I'm going to just step ahead here a little bit what that actually means. Basically, once you do that, you have two people who are submitting the same transaction. So instead of having blockchain that stays on one element after another, you get what's called a fork in the chain. Now these forks happen periodically in blockchain processes, but once you actually can reverse engineer your cryptographic signature, it's going to become endemic. So I just want to jump ahead here because we're kind of already way beyond 1 hour. So fortunately for Bitcoin protocol, there's actually something called Lampert signatures that you can use to, at least to our knowledge now, apply an algorithm, a private key algorithm that does not make you vulnerable to a quantum computer. And the reason for that is that it basically just relies on a hash function. And if you have a hash function, it's a one-way function. You have a message, you throw it into your function, you get a key out of it, and it's very, very hard from the key to get back to the message. It's not impossible, but essentially what you need to do is you have to run through a brute force attack to try to actually reverse a solid hash function. And the equivalent for that in the quantum computing realm is Grover's algorithm, which is faster than what you can do with quicksort, for instance, but it's only polynomial faster. So it's not like the situation with Shor's algorithm where you have essentially a super exponential speed up in comparison to what you can do to a classical machine. So once you know that, then you can essentially engineer something that just works with a hash function. I spelled it out here, but I'm not going to go through the details here. But it's a pretty straightforward process, really. And you essentially just send a bunch of hash keys out, and in your message you can look at each bit of your message, and you can compare it to the hash keys that you got sent out originally, and you're able to validate if the signature is valid or not. And there's no protocol or no algorithm applied in this that, to our current knowledge, is amendable to actually do Shor's algorithm on it. So from that point of view, the only thing that would have to happen for Bitcoin protocol to be considered quantum safe is essentially going away from the original cryptographic system that was picked in 2008 in the original white paper. And if you put that mechanism in place for your public private key encryption scheme, to our current knowledge, you will not be able to break it with a quantum computer. So, yes, please.
I have a question. So with basic kind of public and private key cryptography,
Yeah.
my understanding is that you have, like, when you come up with public and private keys, they're basically like massive, like really large prime numbers, and then due to whatever algorithm, it's very hard to factorize those large numbers, and that's why, like regular computers, it's easy to, anyway, it's harder to brute force, basically. So with the quantum computer, you can brute force it much faster and, figure out the private key using those messages. But when you do that, since the quantum computer is much faster, can you not just come up with like a longer key that's then even harder to brute force that then another quantum computer can no longer? Like, is it just a matter of creating longer public and private keys, or is it something that's more fundamentally different?
Well, the thing with Shor's algorithm is even if you double the key length, if you have something like Moore's law for quantum computers eventually, it's going to take Shor's algorithm just a couple of years to catch up to the doubling of length. So it's essentially become technically feasible again to have a device that can break these kind of algorithms. So that's why really there's this short term for post-quantum algorithms, where you basically try to find ways where you think the quantum computer simply does not have a significant advantage over classical machines.
Is that expected to like keep going forever, or because it's like with regular computers, Moore's law, I think people are thinking it'll kind of level up soon.
Well,
with quantum computers, is it the same thing?
It's a very, very good question. The thing with the quantum computers right now is, in comparison to transistors, what is the equivalent of a transistor on a quantum chip? They're gigantic. I mean, they're huge in comparison. So the ability to shrink this down, we are just at the very beginning. I think really like we just back in the 60s when the first transistors came on, that's where the quantum hardware is at this point. So yeah, it's going to, once you actually have the engineering ability to scale it up, it's going to have a run of 50 years at least before you hit losing the limit of what you can do. So yeah, I'd say it's going to go for a long time. And that basically just excludes even photonics. But that is just the current kind of leading edge of the hardware, which is all 12 chunks in superconducting circuitry. And one of the experiments that was reported recently is very interesting with photonics, where the instead of implementing just a qubit, they basically implement an n qubit. So then you have n states that you can encode into one superposition. And if you are able to leverage that in a photonic chip, and photons basically don't take any space, you're talking a completely different ballgame. So yeah, I'd say we are way outside Moore's law once we are actually there in quantum computing engineering.
So sorry, how far out do you think we are from AI being able to reverse engineer these private keys? Like if you had to sort of give a very general.
For the D-Wave, if you estimate it based on the scaling, I mean, they are the ones obviously that have a device that you can actually buy and then actually can do something that does not look trivial. So they go with the square of n, of square of the key lengths. And if they manage to double their qubit count every 16 months, and you do the math, then you would get to, within 10 years, they can break the current standard RSA key length. So then your bank transactions would no longer be safe if you use SSL. And that's assuming that algorithm scales, and that the D-Wave is also making the same kind of strides that they used to.
So even if you keep your cryptocurrency offline, right?
Well,
like they're not safe. Like even if you have them in cold storage.
It's safe as long as you when you never did a transaction. So if you mine your bitcoins, so it's like if somebody who just mined bitcoins and you never ever want to spend them, you're safe because then your public key has never been exposed. But as soon as your public key is exposed, then somebody can impersonate you if they have a quantum computer. I mean, in practice, obviously, you're going to do a transaction, and let's say you want to unload all your bitcoins in one go. You're probably still going to be faster than somebody trying to impersonate you, because they still have to first find your or load down your personal key, and then they have to still run the quantum algorithm, which is going to be fast, but not necessarily fast enough to prevent you from unloading all your bitcoins. But after that, then they can basically still try to.
But so if, for example, you unload all of your Bitcoin, or you do a transaction, and you're like, well, this private key is no longer safe, you can drop them into a new wallet, technically, because you haven't exposed that public key?
That's a good point, yes. Yeah, I think you can.
In this kind of context, also you have to pay attention to the fact that if you don't use the same account, you actually are probably quite safe in the Bitcoin world. And by default, Bitcoin has been architected in such a way that every transaction actually will change address, so where the remaining Bitcoins are being sent to, are not sent back to your previous address, they're sent to a completely independent key pair. And the only thing they actually disclose is the path itself. There's been a wonderful talk by Nicholas Bourgeois at UCL about 4 years ago, which has nothing to do with quantum resistance, but has to do predominantly with random number generators in implementations, where essentially as long as you never reuse the same address after you spend any money from it, you're actually protected not just by the public-private key encryption, but you're also protected by the hashing algorithm. So only if you have wallets that are implemented in such a way that you have the same address every time for every transaction, then you become vulnerable. And as soon as you start spending from that wallet, you should simply destroy the public key as well and reuse it elsewhere.
Interesting. So that's basically implementing what you thought about.
What about actually redoing all the hashes from some sort of class? Actually alter the blockchain history here so much faster than everybody else. And is there any research into quantum proof of works? Proofs of work?
Yeah, so quantum proof of work, I think that is certainly, I think a threat that needs to be taken serious. I don't know if there has been research done on it, but if you have a proof of work problem that a quantum computer can do much faster, you get to this problem of this 51% of mining capacity, and you could do attacks with that angle. So I think that is certainly a valid concern. So essentially what you want to do is you want to have proof of work algorithms that you don't think a quantum computer can do so much better on than like a Shor's algorithm. Now if you had a problem that is only amenable to Grover kind of attack, you still have much more horsepower with a quantum computer, but it's relatively it's contained still, right? I mean, if you have a whole network to go on against, you need still a lot of quantum computing power to be able to overwhelm that. But if it's something like a factorization problem for your mining, and you get the kind of speed that Shor's algorithm gives you, then yeah, you can easily overwhelm the entire other miners.
Are there any kind of quantum-specific algorithms, for example, like an analog measurement function? You want to measure the frequency of a signal, and be limited by the thermal noise. So is there any kind of problem like that which takes a certain amount of time due to the uncertainty principle where you can't measure it with less than a certain time? And something like that. So you would basically be relying on potential users.
Okay, so you're basically going to have like a physical property that dictates the time that for you to be able to run that mining algorithm.
Or not to move to a proof of work, so it takes some operation takes a certain
Exactly. Yeah. Now that's an interesting idea. I've never heard, but again, I'm not really a blockchain expert, but I haven't seen anything that basically tries to tie it to physical property like that would guarantee you that you need a certain time, no matter how much computing power you throw at it. The original idea was simply with the mining load, the equating cost for the miners. So it was just a trade-off of basically having this cost, and on the other hand, the incentive for mining is the Bitcoin, the reward you get. So if you just tie the microserver, if you could just tie it to a physical property like that, there may not be enough cost associated to it to actually make it enough of a challenge.
So I looked into it. Apparently, the only thing in the original paper that any properties this proof of work has to have, it should take roughly 10 minutes to execute, and it should just make it too expensive to alter the blockchain. So
Yes.
So I mean, if you use some physical property that's limited by Planck's constant or the uncertainty principle that you can make this measurement in less than 10 minutes, that might be good enough. I mean,
Yeah, it might be. It's an interesting idea, absolutely. And I mean the whole proving and mining protocols, they are very much still in flux. And you're probably heard about the proof of stake approach that Ethereum wants to do now. So I certainly think it may have merit. But was another question, or?
I have one more.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Has anyone looked at analog analog computers? I mean, are they equivalent to quantum computers? Or is that
No, absolutely not. An analog computer, a classical analog computer, is also Turing complete. So the fascinating thing about the quantum computer is that we had, for the first time, a device that can do more than a Turing machine. So there are theoretical proof that any classic analog computer, it can't outperform a Turing machine. On a principle level, so as long as you trust that these mathematicians did their job properly, I mean, they believe they proved that. With the quantum computer, the big surprise was that something that there's an additional information resource out there that does something that goes beyond what the classical system can possibly achieve. And throughout, I mean, for the longest time, since Turing essentially, I mean, it was really thought that he understood what computability means. And basically it meant you had a Turing machine. The only additional thing maybe you can put in there is you have an infinite amount of resources theoretically and you can put in a true source of random noise or something like that. And that gives you a probabilistic Turing machine. But it doesn't really, nobody thought there would be something beyond that. And then you actually get this completely new resource out of quantum mechanics that gives you computational capabilities that are really something new in terms of the complexity that you can tackle. I think that was really the big surprise.
So I want to point out one information in your presentation about DOA factorization.
Yeah.
I myself is from the DOA.
Oh, awesome.
So I joined DOA about 4 years ago. I think that number you mentioned was about like before 2010. That was probably on a 128 qubit system, aka Raynier system. And as far as I know, that research has been discontinued. Like the company has shifted the focus dramatically on machine learning in recent years. So factorization is not like an active research area at DOA for the following reasons. First of all, Schwar's algorithm was designed for universal quantum computers, and ours are adiabatic quantum computers.
Right.
So even for that factorization number you mentioned was not on Schwar's algorithm.
Right.
It's with clever design of the specific language that the adiabatic quantum computer is using, we can factor a number like that.
Right.
I believe if we are to continue the research like that way, with the 2,000 qubit, we can factor a much larger number than what you mentioned before.
Right.
But unfortunately, that research has been discontinued due to a lot of reasons, business reasons and investor reasons. There's something I cannot mention. On the other hand, a very good point of information in the presentation is adiabatic quantum computing is actually equivalent to universal quantum computing. There was a paper published by MIT professor Seth Lloyd in 2004, 2005. The title was like adiabatic quantum computing is equivalent to universal quantum computing, something like that.
Right.
Anybody who is interested, I can point out.
That's very good point. Yeah.
So, having said those, I think I understand the reason why the company has shifted gear towards machine learning application because of reasons you've mentioned. First of all, in machine learning, if you look at the landscape of machine learning, a heavy focus of machine learning is now focused on deterministic machine learning, aka like GPU powered machine learning. So if you think about what GPU does, is actually linear algebra, right? Like matrix computation or tensor computation, even for TPU.
Yeah.
All those either FPGA based or ASIC based hardware are like digital, based on digital structure. A quantum computer, if you think of a quantum computer is a probabilistic engine.
Right.
So about like 2 decades ago, there was still some research on probabilistic machine learning, and those kind of research has been largely abandoned due to the reasons in the following. First of all, sampling from distribution, a probabilistic distribution is really hard. That's why, like including Professor Jeff Hinton's work on Boltzmann machine has kind of been abandoned mostly in the last couple of years. But what is available classically are approximation methods like contrastive divergence or persistent contrast divergence. But if you think about that, CD and contrast divergence, say for CD and PCD, those methods, the reason why you're using CD or PCD because first of all, you approximate a problem of sampling from distribution to another problem like MCMC like method. So literally you go from Monte Carlo Markov chain, you go, in theory, if you go infinite number of steps, the samples you get out of that chain is guaranteed to from the original distribution. But by saying infinite number of steps, the computation is really, really expensive. So that's why you say, okay, I will stop after a few number of steps. Then you assume that sample is from the target distribution, which for most of the cases are not. But the interesting thing is CD and PCD works for most of the problems at the beginning, but in the end, once you're at a stage of tuning your model to the final optimal model, those method fails. That's why a lot of researchers disappointed in probabilistic machine learning. They move away and they move into deterministic machine learning. And quantum computer solve the problem in a different way, especially the AQC that deal with really solve this problem differently. Quantum computer use the quantum mechanics, including superposition, entanglement, and tunneling to solve the probabilistic model directly using those basic quantum mechanics. So imagine now you can revive the Boltzmann machine work using this quantum computer, which means you can sample the Boltzmann distribution natively using the quantum mechanics. Wouldn't that be something fantastic? That's why in the recent years, D-Wave have moved into the probabilistic machine learning domain. And the hope is like, okay, if there are some really tough sampling problem from probabilistic machine learning framework, and also some really hard optimization problem, especially those NP-hard optimization problem, maybe if you can figure out a way of mapping that problem to the quantum hardware, you can use the quantum processor as a co-processor to your existing architecture, including CPU, GPU, and TPU, things like that. You only put those really hard problems on quantum computer, but use all the benefit of this existing classic computer. Then your machine learning model will be much better off than what you can do.
As an additional resource, basically for the sampling of the. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So, by the way, I just want to make an announcement. Like, we are working with the CDL lab here, the Creative Destruction lab here at University of Toronto to start a quantum machine learning program. It's going to kick off this September. Now it's in the application stage. Anybody who would like to learn more about quantum computing and also probabilistic machine learning, feel free to apply. And there's really limited number of seats.
Right. Yeah. Good point. No, thank you very much. All right. So, if there are no more questions, I have one little last goodie. Assuming we have sound here, because we heard the name so many times that I figured in the end we want to give him the last words and have actually Peter Shore explain his algorithm, which, as we know, oh no, we can't do it. You're sorry, I don't have a flash player. So, started with a computer problem and ended with a computer problem.
Where do you deal with?
But I'm going to upload this, and it doesn't want to deal with anyhow. So yeah, but it's nice to be able to see Peter Shore explain it in his own words, and he's again a quite brilliant mind to be able to come to this. So that would be my last words. Thank you very much again for coming.